Okay guys, so in this video we had a look at creating support to end or finish a composed email, or like a draft basically. So as we can see here, add support to continue on draft email. So let's look at that. So here we have a bunch of draft emails, and let's say that I wanted to finish one of those. So I go and click here and I fill this out with some gibberish like that. I hit send, and now my email has been submitted successfully. And I can do this over and over and over, and I can click and it gets sent like that. And as you can see, my number here is actually going down as well as I'm submitting new emails. Cool, so let's look at how that functionality was actually implemented. So there's quite a few things that have changed now. We can see here that I made a small rename here. Previously I just used now to express like the viewed at date, and I thought that wasn't as nice as I wanted, so I changed that to viewed at to be a little bit more descriptive on the input. And then I've added this endpoint for delete. And the reason why I want to have the delete endpoint for my email is to be able to remove and basically just remove an email. Because when I have a draft email, I have an unfinished email. And when we submit that email, we are actually creating a new email or an outgoing email, and we still have the old one. And to me, it made more sense to just remove the draft email and just create a new email that is the outgoing email, as opposed to trying to update a email that is a draft and assert that it's, going through the right pipe and so forth. So that's why I added this, so we can now remove emails. And then we have our little update here where we can update a draft email. And basically all it is that you grab the email ID, the recipient, the subject, and the message. And it's just a new method called update draft email, where we pass in the email ID because it's an update, so we need to know the ID of the email we want to update, and then we pass in the rest. And I did a few small renames down here as well, as you can see. So if we go and look at the email source, we can see that there's two methods that have been added: update draft email and remove email, and these should be fairly straightforward, where we can actually go in and look at these. So we can see here that update draft email, nothing special here. We simply grab and we just find the email and we set these new values, update these values, and then we save basically. And remove draft or remove email is also fairly simple. We grab the email and then we call remove on that email. That's about it really. And then of course we've added some tests to that as well. So you can see here that there are some basic tests for both of these methods. Nothing too fancy where anything special is happening. This might be a little bit worth looking at actually down here. So let's have a look down here. So basically what's happening here is that I'm stubbing off the mock in the find, and then I create a fake email that has this save method here, and then basically all I'm doing is that I have this mock email module, and I return a promise that resolves to this mock email when I call find by ID, and then I set these values here, instantiate my service, and then I call with all of these input parameters. What's interesting here is that I basically just make sure that each of these values have actually been set on the mock email to begin with, because I expect these mutations to happen. Alright, and then I updated my reducer. Now the reason why I did that is because now I've had to change the way that our composed email component works. We'll look at that in just a moment, but basically a lot of the logic that was originally in the navigation list has been updated and is now actually living inside of the composed email component. It will make sense in just a moment. So here we have quite a few updates. We can actually see here that on the left here there's actually quite a few things that have changed. We can see that, alright, originally we just passed in the email, but now we actually have a component class around this inbox row, where we have an onClick function that we can see is going to, basically all it does is that it checks on the passed in email and the type of that email, and checks if it's a draft. Because if it is draft, then we want to call the onDraftClick method that is being passed into this component as well with that email, because we want a different behavior. The reason we want a different behavior is if I click this, I want this modal to appear with my information. But if I click, say, in an inbox, I want to actually go to that email. So that's a behavior difference that we want to have. And that's basically what this is doing. It's just checking if the type is of type draft, and then it just prevents the default behavior, and we simply call the passed-in method. And then we have a few other changes we can see here that, all right, we have basically just done a little bit of a reformatting here, but this thing here, like we have had a link here originally where we just put these values, right? But now I've actually wrapped that in another component which I call inbox row link, where I pass in the content, the email ID, and an on-click method. And as you can imagine, that's just to kind of handle this case right here. All right, and then we have this container that is just wrapping my inbox row component, and it's fairly straightforward, I hope. On draft click, expects an email, and then it basically grabs that information and wraps it in a compose form structure. We can actually look at compose form. I should see it here somewhere. Compose form, yeah. So basically all it is a method that takes in this object and extracts out the values that it wants. And there's a bit of logic here where we check the subject, because as we know, if there is no subject, we actually just occupy that with the no subjects string here. And we don't want that to be the default value in the form when we show it to the user. So we simply check if it's that or if it's undefined, and then we set it to an empty string. Otherwise, it's going to be the actual subject. So that hopefully that makes a bit of sense to you. And yeah, and then we have the set form function, which we will look at in just a moment. And then we have show compose email, which we'll also check in just a moment. So this is the inbox row component, or inbox row link component. As we saw earlier, all I've done is that I moved in like React Router's link component into this component, and now I'm passing in some information to just make that a little bit cleaner from the consumer side of things. And I've also made a few updates to inbox email, which is the model that we're getting from the server. And the reason why I want to do that is simply because I needed to add, as we can see here, a type. And then basically we have the, now we also have to express the possibility that we may have recipients, which we didn't have before, because the email may or may not have recipients, because it may or may not be a draft. And if it is a draft, I might not have that information. So I needed to make sure that, yeah, I'm handling this join case here. All right, let's have a look at the navigation bar. And as you can see here, there's quite a few things that have been removed. So earlier this was a component class, but now it's actually just a method, a stateless function, or a stateless component, if you will, that gets the onCompose method passed into it, and everything else is pretty much just removed. As you can see here, compose email was originally getting all of its methods passed in, or the statement passed in from this component, but now it doesn't get any of that because it's a smart component in of itself that holds all of this information by itself. And as I touched on earlier, I did this because now compose email is a more complicated component than it was earlier. The state that we have now needs to be a little bit more universal, because we need to be able to communicate that both if I click compose like this, and if I actually click on this row here, I need to show the modal. But as you can see here, there's information being shown now, and compose just it shows an empty state. So I have a little bit of difference in behavior and two various components that can show this modal. So I felt that it was appropriate to move it into a more advanced structure. It was justified now. And the same thing goes here for this for the container, for the navigation bars container. All I did was, as you can see here, remove all of this, and this is moved into another container, which we will look at in just a moment. And now all this does is that when we click on compose, which is when we click the send button, we simply dispatch show compose email true, which is going to show that modal. That's it basically. And now let's look at compose email, which is now have seen quite a few changes as well. So we can see here that my original approach with using the form reference has changed now. And the reason for that is because I now need to be able to hold two types of states. I don't just want to grab the form as is and just extract the values from that form, because now I need to be able to also preoccupy this in the form, as we saw here. Now when I click this, there should be preoccupied information. So now I can't just grab the form. I actually need a Redux state to hold that information. We can actually look at that. So if I go here, and we see all of my little dispatches here, and we can look at the state, and we can see here that my form is all nice and empty, and we also have this concept of an original form, but we will look at that in just a moment. I click here, and now we see that this information has been preoccupied. So now the original form has the original information which we instantiated this modal with, and if I start making updates to my form, we see that the actual form state has been updated. And this will all make sense in just a moment. So as you can see here, we have the original form, the form, and the path name being passed into the onClose or the onCancel. OnSubmit is or OnSend is fairly much the same thing. And we can see here that onChange has seen a bit of a change here. So the text field is now actually holding an onChange method, which is onRecipientChange, which is just a method that runs every time I make a field update to this form field here. And I have a value, which is the form.recipients, which is, as you saw earlier, that's just the text that holds the recipients. And the same thing is true for the rest of these fields, right? And then we have an onCancel here. So let's actually have a look at where all this is happening and why it's happening. Now this is the meat of this update to the code. So let's have a look here. We have the path name, the open, which is just compose email.show, which is this internal state that we show in order that holds whether or not we actually show this compose email component or not. As you can see here, now it's true. If I close it, it's false. And that's hopefully that makes sense. It's just the thing that determines whether or not we see the modal or not. And then we have the original form and the form, which holds the two different states for that. And here we have onRecipientChange, which is just going to take in the event of actually updating this field, and we are simply going to call setFormField with the text recipients and event target.values, which is just going to set that value. And the reason why I do it this way is because it's a little bit more flexible. Some people like to have one action method for each field. I think that's very unflexible. So what I like to do is to just have a generic setFormField action, and then I have a key value approach where I can set the key of the form field I want to update and the value, and that way I can be more flexible and just reuse that a little bit. And then we have our onCancel, which is going to grab the original form, the form, and the path name and just extract out the information we want. We are going to hide the modal and reset the form so we don't have any old state, because that's very important. It's important to clear your form state when you have these forms that you could possibly submit, so you don't have outdated information in the form. And then I've wrapped this entire logic structure in a try-catch, because if something goes wrong with the network calls, I want to show the alert. So first and foremost, we are going to check if the email type is a draft and if the form field has changed. And in order for us to know if the form fields have changed, we need both the original form and the form. Because as you can imagine, if we have a type email, so the logic is that, all right, I open this, and now I want to still, if we look at the network here, if I just click outside like that, you see that nothing gets updated. But if I do something like that, and I'm on my draft and I update it again and I click outside, I want that to actually be updated. I actually want this new information, as you can see here, to be added to the ongoing draft so that the user can continuously update the draft. And only when I actually hit send will we send the actual email and it has been submitted for being sent to the recipients, right? So that's why we have this method here. we can actually have a look at, that's the test. So let's have a look at form fields changed. It's fairly straightforward. So we grab the original form, the current form, we grab the keys from the original form, and then we do a sum, which basically checks if any of this is true. And then we loop through all the keys in the original form and just check whether or not there is a field, a matching field that is not equal on the current form. And if there is, we know that the form has been updated and we should resave it. Easy peasy. So that's about that. And then of course we submit the form and we do some basic error checking, and if the response isn't okay, we throw an error so we can catch it. And then we have an on draft sent, which will make sense in just a moment. And then we have another one where we check if the email type is not equal to draft, and the email was started. And this is just to handle the case, okay, so now we're not updating an existing draft. We are creating a fresh email, and if that email has been started, which is in line with the logic we had before, it's just that we need to check this first. And then it's basically the same thing as we saw earlier. We send the email request and yeah, we just check the response, and that's basically it. This is just to handle, well, we can actually look at that again just for the sake of looking at it. So I fill this out and I click like that, and you can see that now I actually submitted that information, and we see that, hey, I have this new email. I can also update this directly and say, hey, that's done, and then it gets submitted, right? Cool, so that's that. I know this is a little bit complicated, but this is the sort of logic you kind of get to when you have more sophisticated applications. And then we have the onsend, which is basically the same information. Like, it's very similar to what we had earlier. I have this try catch, and like the only real difference to this logic is that I basically have this thing here where I show the compose email function. Like I send this action in order to hide the email if I have submitted the email, and then I reset the form, right? And then we have this little thing here, which is fairly interesting. This is new, where we just check if there is a draft email ID, because it might be the case that we are actually working with the draft that we saw earlier. Because if we have this thing here, if I click here, there is no, like, this is a fresh email, right? There's no draft email ID, it's not an existing thing. But if I click here, we actually have an ID. And if that's the case, we check that, okay, so if there is a draft email ID, then we create a remove email request. And the reason why we want to do that is because if we have a look at that, all we want to do now is that we want to delete the email. Like, once the email has been submitted, we want to delete the draft email, as I mentioned earlier. And that's all this is. All it checks is if we are creating a new email or if it's a draft. If it's a draft, we are going to create the new email, and we are going to remove the draft. That's all this is. And then we have some basic catch logic here, which handles the error case. And then this is fairly much the same thing as we have seen before. And then we have an on email sent, which is a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same thing still. The main difference here is that I noticed that when we actually submit the email, we weren't updating the overview, because what I want to be able to do is that if I click like this, and we can see, let's notice that first we see that this is a 21, and I click here and I start updating this, and I click send. I want this number to be updated immediately, so the user can realize that it actually, acknowledge that it changed, right, that the draft was submitted correctly. So that's basically what we're doing here. We're simply making sure that we update the email overview, and that's about it, really. And then we have this on draft send function, which does basically the same thing. It's pretty much the same logic as in the previous examples. It's just that we make sure to set the email overview when we actually submit that draft. Cool. I know this was a lot of information, but let's stick with it. So we've already looked at that. We can just skim through these actions, because these are just the different actions we've seen so far, and it's not all that interesting, I think. It's just the different objects that we send through the dispatch, through the Redux pipe. And here are our action labels, And here is our reducer. So we have this original form state and the form state, and then well, the initial state of the compose email module. And here's the reducer, where we basically just, we do the mapping. That's about it. You can look at this logic. It should be fairly straightforward. So we've already looked at our UI. Well, these are some basic tests for the remove email. And since we have an update as well, we have this, we have this request. It's fairly, I hope these tests, I don't think we need to touch on these all that much because they're fairly standard, like they're fairly simple. You can just have a little bit of a look through to see that we are actually adding test. Email was started. This is an old test, we just moved it. And form field changed, same thing here. This is a fairly simple test suite where basically, all right, the returns false if there's nothing in the form. So we have these two objects, and all it, as we saw earlier, all it's going to do is that this is not going to return anything meaningful because hey, there's no change. And the same thing goes here. These two are equal, but these two are not equal. So we're going to return a positive there, then say that hey, that's actually a change to the form. Right, this one is a little bit new. Recipient to recipient's string to recipient's array. Now the reason why we have this one here is because of this thing here. So this send email request, which is the old module that we have for when we send an email. Earlier, you may remember that we actually had this logic where we can actually look at the logic just for the sake of it. You may recognize this where we have this string of recipients that the user inputs, and we just want to format that information and return it as an array so that we can submit it to the server. Because when the user inputs it, it's just a string, but we want to split it out into an array of recipients. And since the send email request and the update email request both need this logic, I didn't want to duplicate that, so I extracted that out into a separate method or a separate function and simply imported that logic, and now they both can use it instead of getting that naughty duplication. And email was started. That's still the same logic. Most of this is just because I had to move things around a little bit. And and then finally we have this endpoint method here, the API method, which is just draft email, where it takes the email ID and returns a string that maps to the draft emails endpoint. Cool. So I know this was a lot of information, but hopefully you could follow along. And that's basically it. Now we are ready to move this card to testing. And next up is going to have support for, we're going to add support for pagination. So let's look at that.